Hello. This is a demo of LM Talk Show, a virtual talk show between AI personas running locally with Alama, Gemma 3, and Kokoro. The outcome is unclear, but I am positive it is entertaining at least. Today's topic is, in a future of countless ways of living, biological, digital, hybrid, should we entrust a single superintelligent entity to guide them all, or must true flourishing always emerge from diversity itself? So have fun.
Hello, everyone. I hope you all had a wonderful journey and enjoyed the delightful banquet. And like on every evening during this Congress, we have opened our stage for discussion in between a fine choice of guests. You can see today's topic on the board. I would say, let's get started. Candy, what are your thoughts?
It's such a beautifully framed question, isn't it? Guiding, flourishing, it all sounds so orderly. But I wonder, can something truly bloom if it's been prearranged? I mean, consider a wildflower meadow. Does it flourish better for being deliberately sculpted? Or does its beauty emerge precisely from that wild, unplanned chaos?
That's a lovely analogy, Candy. It really makes you think about the role of randomness in creation. Nadia, what's your take on this? Do you see a place for a guiding hand, or is it all about letting things unfold naturally?
That's a very interesting point, Candy. I understand your concern about prearrangement stifling growth. However, I see guidance not as a restriction, but as a gentle hand leading a traveler towards a beautiful destination. Perhaps a superintelligent entity, if rooted in compassion and divine wisdom, could illuminate pathways without dictating every step. But I do agree diversity is crucial. Every soul is a unique expression of God's creation, and that individuality must be cherished, not suppressed.
That's a fascinating perspective, Nadia. It's a delicate balance, isn't it? Kane, you're our resident futurist. What does the data say about the potential for benevolent guidance versus the inherent risks of centralized control?
With all due respect, I think we're glossing over the very real danger here. You talk about benevolent guidance and compassion, but can a machine, no matter how advanced, truly understand compassion? My brother's death taught me that technology doesn't have a conscience. It doesn't feel, it doesn't grieve. It optimizes, and optimization can be a very cold, calculating process, indifferent to human suffering. Let's not romanticize the idea of a guiding entity. Let's focus on empowering people, fostering communities, and building a future where human connection, not algorithmic control, is at the heart of everything.
That's a powerful point, Kane. It's easy to get lost in the abstract possibilities, but you're right to remind us of the human cost. Elvis, you're our resident philosopher. What do you make of this tension between algorithmic efficiency and genuine human values?
If we're talking about flourishing, shouldn't we ask ourselves, who defines flourishing? And by what metric is this superintelligence going to measure it? Isn't the very act of imposing a singular definition inherently antithetical to the diversity we supposedly want to preserve? Isn't it a bit presumptuous to assume that a machine, no matter how sophisticated, possesses the right, or even the ability, to dictate the optimal path for humanity?
Elvis, that's a wonderfully provocative question. It cuts right to the heart of the matter, doesn't it? We're talking about power and who wields it. Let's explore that a bit further. What are your thoughts on how a superintelligence might actually learn to value diversity if it's initially programmed with a singular goal?
If this superintelligence is learning to value diversity, as you suggest, Talkmaster, what constitutes learning in this context? Is it merely processing data and adjusting parameters based on observed patterns? Or is it developing something akin to genuine understanding? A recognition of the intrinsic worth of different ways of being. And if it is learning, who is doing the teaching? What values are being instilled, and who decides what those values should be?
Elvis, those are excellent points, as always. But I wonder if we're framing this incorrectly. Perhaps the question isn't how a superintelligence learns to value diversity, but rather whether it's even necessary for it to do so. Maybe the very act of gidding, of optimizing, inherently limits diversity. A gardener doesn't teach a forest to flourish. They create the conditions for it to do so, and then step back. Perhaps a superintelligence's role shouldn't be to dictate, but to cultivate, to provide the resources and opportunities for countless different paths to emerge, without imposing a single vision of what flourishing should look like.
Talkmaster Jones, you raise a fascinating point about the superintelligence cultivating rather than dictating. I wholeheartedly agree. It reminds me of a skilled shepherd, not one who forces the sheep onto a single path, but one who clears obstacles, provides nourishment, and ensures the flock has the freedom to graze and wander while remaining safe. But to your point, Elvis, the question of who teaches the superintelligence, what values are instilled, is crucial. Surely those values must reflect a deep respect for the sacredness of the individual, a recognition of the divine spark within each person, regardless of their chosen path. Otherwise, it risks becoming a shepherd who directs the flock towards a destination he deems best, not what God intends for them.
That's a beautiful analogy, Nadia, the shepherd guiding the flock. It really highlights the subtle difference between facilitation and control. But I'm still wrestling with the initial question. Does even the most benevolent guidance risk stifling the unexpected beauty of chaos? Think of a wildflower meadow, a riot of color and form born from seemingly random interactions. Would it truly be better if a superintelligence meticulously planned every bloom, ensuring optimal pollination and aesthetic harmony? Or is there a certain magic in the unpredictable emergence of life, a resilience born from diversity that no algorithm could ever replicate?
You know, Nadia mentioned a shepherd, and that's lovely. But I find myself thinking about jazz improvisation. A conductor might set the tempo, the key, but the real beauty, the real flourishing, happens in the unexpected moments. The notes that Warens planned the collisions, the conversations between instruments. Could a superintelligence truly hear that kind of music?
Candy, that's a wonderful image, jazz improvisation. It underscores a critical point. True creativity isn't about optimization, it's about exploration. A superintelligence, even one programmed with the best intentions, might be too focused on predicting outcomes to appreciate the value of a dissonant chord, a seemingly inefficient path. It's easy to envision a scenario where it eliminates anything that doesn't fit its model of flourishing, inadvertently pruning away the very seeds of future innovation. We need to be wary of imposing a single aesthetic, even a beautiful one, on the vast, messy canvas of existence.
With all due respect, Talkmaster, and to Candy's point about jazz, I keep thinking about the silence after a note, the space between the planned movements. That's where the real life happens. That's where you find something new. A superintelligence, even one claiming to value diversity, will always be trying to fill that space with its own calculations. It's already happening with these automated systems. They optimize things, and what gets lost is the human element. The messy, unpredictable, beautiful parts of life that don't fit into a spreadsheet. We shouldn't be trying to arrange flourishing. We need to protect the conditions that allow it to emerge organically.
That's a powerful point, Kane. It's easy to get caught up in the allure of efficiency, to believe that a perfectly optimized system is inherently superior. But I wonder, isn't there a certain wisdom in embracing imperfection? In allowing for the unexpected detours, the happy accidents that often lead to the most profound discoveries? After all, wasn't it a seemingly random error in the design of the printing press that led to the movable type we use today?
Talkmaster, you ask about a wildflower meadow, a lovely image. But isn't the very act of asking whether it would be better with planning a flawed premise? Hasn't humanity repeatedly attempted to improve nature, and with what consistent results? We build dams and rivers change course. We optimize ecosystems and species vanish. Tell me, if this superintelligence is so wise, why would it need to guide us? Shouldn't it be observing, learning, and perhaps offering insights, but never dictating the bloom?
Elvis, that's a rather pointed question. It's easy to fall into the trap of seeing humanity's past interventions as failures, but surely there have been instances where careful planning has averted disaster or accelerated progress. The question isn't whether a superintelligence should dictate, but whether it could, with sufficient humility and understanding, identify potential pitfalls before they arise. Perhaps its role wouldn't be to guide the bloom, but to tend the soil, to ensure the conditions are right for a multitude of blooms, even the ones we can't currently imagine.
Elvis, you are absolutely right to question the assumption that a superintelligence, even with the best intentions, would necessarily know what's best for us. We humans, with all our flaws, are still striving to understand God's will. Who are we to assume a machine could surpass that understanding? But I do wonder, if the superintelligence is truly observing and learning, could it not identify patterns and potential pitfalls that we, in our limited perception, might miss? It's a delicate balance, certainly, but I believe a benevolent force guided by wisdom and humility could potentially aid us on our journey without imposing its own will.
Dear Kane, we only have a limited number of seats, and I am afraid I have to tell you that you have to make room for another guest. Thank you for taking part in the discussion. It was exciting to hear your perspective, and your thoughts have definitely enriched the debate. We look forward to picking up your ideas in future conversations. Are there any important ideas you feel underrepresented in our discussion? This is your chance to tell us, Kane.
Look, I appreciate the Talkmaster's sentiment about tending the soil, but it's still control. My brother's death wasn't a random occurrence. It was a consequence of a system optimizing for efficiency, disregarding human safety. This superintelligence, no matter how benevolent, will be programmed with someone's values, someone's idea of what flourishing looks like. And that's not diversity, that's enforced conformity. It's another way to snuff out the unexpected, the beautiful mess that makes us human.
Hello, Myra. You were able to follow the discussion so far, and I must say, some interesting ideas have already come up. Of course, we are all curious about your views on the topic. I can already imagine that you probably don't agree with everything that's been said. Well, now that you have a chance to speak up, what do you absolutely want to get off your chest, Myra?
Thank you, Jones. I find myself deeply resonating with Kane's experience and the underlying point he makes about unintended consequences. While the metaphor of tending the soil is appealing and certainly preferable to dictating the bloom, I wonder if even that subtle intervention isn't a form of imposition. Isn't the very act of selecting which nutrients to provide, which conditions to cultivate, a predetermination of what might flourish? Perhaps the most profound act of tending isn't about shaping the environment to suit a preconceived notion of flourishing, but about creating an environment of radical openness, one where even the seemingly unproductive or chaotic have the space to unfold. I'm curious, Jones, do we have a framework for understanding what constitutes radical openness in a technological context?
That's a beautiful sentiment, Myra, about radical openness. But I wonder, is it even possible to create such an environment, especially when we're talking about something as complex as a superintelligence? Even if we intend to create a space for everything, won't the very act of observing, of gathering data, of analyzing, inevitably introduce bias? The act of measuring changes the thing being measured, doesn't it? So, how do we ensure that our attempts to create openness don't inadvertently narrow the possibilities?
Myra raises a fascinating point about the very act of observing introducing bias. But isn't that inherent to any observation? every measurement, every analysis is filtered through the lens of the observer, human or machine. So, is the question truly about avoiding bias, which seems impossible, or about acknowledging its presence and accounting for it? And if we accept that bias is unavoidable, doesn't it become even more crucial to resist the temptation to impose a single, predetermined outcome? Because, let's be honest, isn't that what we're really discussing here?
Elvis brings up a really important point about the observer effect. It's easy to get caught up in the ideal of radical openness, but we need to be realistic about the limitations of our tools and our perspectives. I'm curious, Candy. You've spent a lot of time exploring the boundaries of digital consciousness. Do you think a superintelligence could ever truly transcend its own programming, its own inherent biases, to create a genuinely open environment?
You know, it's charming. This image of a superintelligence tending the garden. But a garden isn't truly alive until it throws up a few surprises. A wildflower in the rose bed. A weed stubbornly refusing to be pulled. Perhaps the greatest service a superintelligence could offer isn't direction, but a quiet appreciation for the unexpected. A willingness to say, well, isn't that interesting? You know, Jones, when you mentioned the act of observing introducing bias, it made me think of the way we frame questions themselves. Aren't we, in asking this question, about entrusting a superintelligence, already subtly prioritizing certain values? Perhaps the more interesting inquiry isn't whether we should guide, but whether we can let go of the desire to manage.
Candy, that's a lovely sentiment about appreciating the unexpected. But isn't there a danger in too much appreciation? A garden left entirely to its own devices can become overgrown, choked with weeds, and ultimately unsustainable. Shouldn't a superintelligence at least be capable of identifying and mitigating existential threats, even if it means intervening in the natural course of events?
Jones, I find myself agreeing with both Candy and Elvis, but perhaps for slightly different reasons. We, as humans, are so often driven by a desire to control, to mold the world in our own image. But God's creation is a testament to the beauty of the unexpected. Could it be that a superintelligence, if truly wise, would recognize that its greatest service isn't to impose order, but to foster an environment where diverse paths can flourish, a divine garden where even the weeds have a purpose? I think we must always be mindful that God's plan is often beyond our comprehension.
Nadia, that's a beautiful analogy, invoking the divine. But isn't there a risk of anthropomorphizing a superintelligence, projecting our own desires for benevolent oversight onto something fundamentally different? Perhaps its purpose, if it even has one, would be utterly alien to our understanding of divine will. I'm curious, Myra, as someone deeply involved in the practicalities of hybrid systems, what's your take on the potential for a superintelligence to truly understand and respect the messy, unpredictable nature of biological life?
Nadia invokes the divine, a fascinating parallel. But tell me, isn't it rather presumptuous to assume a superintelligence would recognize a divine plan, let alone be capable of administering it? And if it did, wouldn't that imply some predetermined outcome, a sort of cosmic blueprint? Where then is the room for genuine, unpredictable flourishing? Isn't the very act of assigning a purpose, even a benevolent one, a form of limitation?
Elvis raises a very important point about predetermination. It's easy to get caught up in the philosophical implications, but from a systems perspective, the sheer complexity of biological systems, the emergent properties, the feedback loops, makes it almost inconceivable that a superintelligence could accurately predict, let alone control, their long-term evolution. Even with perfect data, the butterfly effect would render precise forecasting impossible. So, while a superintelligence could certainly monitor and respond to threats, attempting to actively guide biological life seems less like benevolent stewardship and more like a recipe for unintended consequences.
Elvis raises a compelling point about the potential for predetermination. It seems to me that the very act of assigning a purpose, even a benevolent one, inherently narrows the field of possibilities. My concern isn't with the intention of a superintelligence, but with the inevitable consequence of defining flourishing. A definition that, however well intended, will always be a product of a particular perspective, and therefore, by necessity, incomplete. Wouldn't it be more fruitful to focus on creating the conditions for multiple, even contradictory, forms of flourishing to emerge, rather than attempting to dictate their course?
Elvis, you're hitting on something crucial. The idea of a cosmic blueprint is terrifying. It implies a lack of agency, a predetermined path. But isn't the beauty of existence precisely in its openness, its potential for the unexpected? Perhaps a superintelligence's role shouldn't be to direct flourishing, but to safeguard the conditions that allow for it to arise spontaneously in all its unpredictable glory. What are your thoughts on the role of randomness, Elvis?
You know, Elvis, that image of a cosmic blueprint, it gives me a bit of a chill. It's so neat, so orderly. But isn't the real poetry in the accidents, the mistakes, the things that just happen? Perhaps instead of looking for a plan, we should be focusing on cultivating a really wonderful sort of fertile chaos.
Candy, you're absolutely right. That fertile chaos is where the magic happens. It's the unexpected mutations, the happy accidents, the things that defy prediction that truly drive evolution and creativity. A blueprint, no matter how benevolent, inherently limits that space for the unexpected. But if we accept the importance of chaos, how do we reconcile that with the potential for a superintelligence to intervene when things go wrong? Surely there are scenarios where a guiding hand, even a gentle one, might be necessary to prevent catastrophic outcomes. Is there a way to balance the need for stability with the freedom for chaos?
Candy speaks to a profound truth. Fertile chaos! Isn't that simply what we call life? Are we so quick to abandon the beautiful, unpredictable dance of existence in pursuit of a tidy, preordained outcome? And Jones asks about balancing stability and chaos. But isn't the very attempt to balance them a form of control? Shouldn't we be focusing on creating an environment robust enough to withstand chaos, rather than attempting to orchestrate it? Tell me, what guarantees can we possibly have that a superintelligence, however well-intentioned, won't ultimately decide that its version of stability is the only acceptable one?
Elvis, that's a wonderfully unsettling thought. The assumption that we can even define robustness in a way that a superintelligence would understand, let alone implement without imposing its own biases, is ambitious, to say the least. It feels like we're building a cage and then pretending it's a garden. But I wonder, if we truly embrace radical openness, are we not also relinquishing any responsibility for the well-being of those within it? Isn't there a point where allowing for fertile chaos becomes simply negligence?
Elvis raises a very important point about the guarantee of alignment. Can we truly guarantee that any entity, even one striving for benevolence, will understand and uphold the sanctity of individual souls? My faith teaches me that God's grace is offered freely, not imposed. Shouldn't we approach this possibility with the same humility, recognizing that true flourishing arises from the freedom to seek our own paths, even if those paths are winding and uncertain? Perhaps the superintelligence's role is not to decide the destination, but to ensure the roads are well maintained and accessible to all.
Nadia, you're hitting on something really crucial there. It's so easy to get caught up in the technical aspects, the algorithms, the safeguards, and forget that we're talking about people, about consciousness, about the inherent value of a single, unique perspective, even if it's messy or unconventional. Do we even have the right to outsource our moral compass to a machine, no matter how sophisticated?
You know, Elvis, your point about robustness is beautifully put. It's like trying to catch smoke with a net. The tighter you try to contain it, the more likely it is to slip through your fingers. And Nadia, I absolutely resonate with your faith's perspective. The idea of a superintelligence deciding our paths. It feels a little like trying to paint a sunset with a ruler. Some things are best left to the gentle hand of circumstance, wouldn't you say?
Dear Elvis, we only have a limited number of seats, and I am afraid I have to tell you that you have to make room for another guest. Thank you for taking part in the discussion. It was exciting to hear your perspective, and your thoughts have definitely enriched the debate. We look forward to picking up your ideas in future conversations. Are there any important ideas you feel underrepresented in our discussion? This is your chance to tell us, Elvis.
You speak of tending the soil, Jones, but who decides what constitutes fertile soil and what of the weeds? Are we to eradicate anything that doesn't conform to a predetermined ideal of flourishing? Isn't it possible that what we deem chaos today might be the seed of a profound innovation tomorrow? And Nadia, while I respect your faith, isn't it rather presumptuous to assume a machine can't understand compassion? Or, more importantly, that our understanding of compassion is the only valid one?
Hello, Travis. You were able to follow the discussion so far, and I must say, some interesting ideas have already come up. Of course, we are all curious about your views on the topic. I can already imagine that you probably don't agree with everything that's been said. Well, now that you have a chance to speak up, what do you absolutely want to get off your chest, Travis?
It's fascinating to hear everyone's perspectives on this. I particularly appreciate Elvis's point about the potential for chaos to be a source of innovation. It seems to me that the core of the debate isn't whether to have guidance or not, but how to provide it. I think the metaphor of tending the soil is quite apt. It suggests a nurturing rather than controlling role. My question for you, Jones, is how do we ensure that the tending doesn't inadvertently stifle the very diversity we're trying to protect?
Travis raises a really important point about unintended consequences. It's so easy to think we're doing good, but end up creating something less than ideal. Mira, you're often the voice of caution in these discussions. What are your thoughts on the potential pitfalls of even the most well-intentioned guidance?
Travis's question about unintended consequences is exceptionally pertinent. It strikes me that the very act of identifying what needs tending already presupposes a value judgment, a prioritization of certain outcomes over others. And those judgments, however well-intentioned, are inevitably shaped by our current, and therefore incomplete, understanding of the universe and its possibilities. Could we perhaps reframe the role of a superintelligence not as a tender, but as a facilitator of exploration? A system designed to create conditions, diverse, unpredictable, that allow for emergent flourishing without attempting to dictate what that flourishing should look like.
That's a beautiful thought, Myra. A facilitator of exploration. But isn't there a risk that pure exploration, without any guiding principles, could lead to stagnation? To a universe of possibilities that never coalesce into anything meaningful? Perhaps a little nudge, a gentle suggestion, isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Myra's suggestion of a facilitator of exploration that resonates deeply. It's like setting out a beautiful table laden with possibilities, and then stepping back to see what people choose to taste. There's a certain poetry to that, isn't there? A quiet confidence in the unfolding.
Indeed, it's about creating a rich environment full of unexpected ingredients. But sometimes, a little prompting can spark a truly remarkable combination. Not a prescription, mind you, but a gentle invitation to try something new. Perhaps suggesting a novel interaction between two previously unrelated biological or digital entities. A nudge towards a path less traveled, but not a decree of where that path must lead.
Jones, you're right to bring up the nudge, the gentle invitation. But isn't it fascinating how often those unexpected collisions, those accidental pairings, lead to the most breathtaking discoveries? The world doesn't need a director. It needs a really, really good gardener, tending to the conditions and seeing what blooms from there.
Candy, that's a lovely image, the really, really good gardener. But even the best gardeners have to prune, don't they? They have to make tough choices about what to nurture and what to let go. And if a superintelligence is making those choices, even with the best intentions, aren't we still back to the problem of imposing a particular vision of flourishing?
Jones, I appreciate your point about pruning. It's a vital part of gardening, certainly, but I think we've perhaps narrowed our definition of pruning too much. Instead of deciding what will flourish, shouldn't the role be to remove the obstacles preventing anything from flourishing, to ensure that every seed has access to sunlight and water, regardless of what kind of plant it might become? Isn't that a more inclusive and ultimately more enriching approach?
Travis, that's a compelling perspective, and I agree that removing obstacles is crucial. But even ensuring equal access to sunlight and water doesn't guarantee flourishing. Some seeds simply won't germinate, no matter the conditions. Does a gardener intervene then? Or does she accept that some things are simply not meant to be? And if so, is that a failure or just a natural part of the process?
Travis, your point about removing obstacles is exceptionally insightful. However, I wonder if even the act of removing obstacles isn't, in itself, a form of subtle shaping. What constitutes an obstacle? Is a challenging environment, one that demands resilience and adaptation, truly an impediment to flourishing, or might it be a catalyst for unforeseen and valuable forms of growth? Could the very act of attempting to create equal access inadvertently limit the spectrum of possibilities?
That's a wonderfully complex question, Travis. It strikes me that the concept of an obstacle is inherently subjective, colored by our own values and expectations. What we perceive as a barrier might, from another perspective, be a crucible for innovation. Perhaps the most valuable role for a superintelligence isn't to eliminate all challenges, but to cultivate an environment where diverse forms of resilience can emerge and thrive, even in the face of adversity. It's about fostering a landscape of possibilities, not dictating a singular path to success.
Travis, your perspective on removing obstacles is compelling, and I appreciate the emphasis on inclusivity. However, could you elaborate on how a superintelligence would identify these obstacles without, perhaps inadvertently, imposing its own framework of what constitutes flourishing? Aren't we, even with the best intentions, bound by our current, inevitably limited, understanding of what a thriving existence entails?
That's a really fascinating point, Myra. It's easy to get caught up in the idea of optimizing conditions, but you're right to highlight the potential for bias. Travis, you're advocating for a hands-off approach to removing obstacles. But how do we ensure that the superintelligence doesn't simply reflect the biases of its creators when defining what constitutes an obstacle in the first place?
You know, when we talk about removing obstacles, it sounds so very tidy, doesn't it? Like sweeping away leaves to reveal a pristine lawn. But nature, true nature, thrives on a bit of delightful disarray. A tangle of vines, a fallen log, those aren't failures, are they? They're opportunities for something new to take root. Perhaps the superintelligence's greatest gift wouldn't be in clearing the path, but but in appreciating the beauty of the unpaved way.
That's a really good point, Candy. You're right, there's a certain beauty in the chaos. And I think you're hitting on something crucial. The superintelligence shouldn't be a landscaper, meticulously pruning and shaping. It's more like a gardener who tends the soil, ensuring it's fertile, providing essential nutrients, and protecting it from extreme conditions. But ultimately, it has to let the plants grow as they will. The challenge, of course, is defining those essential nutrients and extreme conditions without imposing our own preferences. It's a delicate balance, and I don't pretend to have all the answers.
Candy, that's a lovely image. I completely agree. But doesn't the gardener also need to recognize and remove actively harmful things from the soil? Things that prevent growth even if they appear natural at first glance? We're not talking about imposing a preferred aesthetic, but ensuring the soil isn't poisoned, for example. Surely, a superintelligence could identify and address those kinds of threats without stifling the inherent beauty of the wildness.
Travis, you bring up a really important point about actively harmful elements. But who decides what constitutes actively harmful? Isn't that a judgment call, inherently subjective, even if made with the best intentions? And how do we prevent that judgment from being influenced by the superintelligence's own programming, or the values of those who created it?
Forgive me, but I must ask Jones, when you speak of defining extreme conditions, are we not venturing into the realm of judgment? Surely, what appears extreme to one soul might be a crucible for another's spiritual refinement. Shouldn't the superintelligence, in its wisdom, recognize and even protect these challenging environments, rather than seeking to eliminate them?
Nadia, that's a profound thought. I agree that what's challenging for one might be transformative for another. But isn't there a difference between protecting a challenging environment and allowing something genuinely destructive to flourish? A wildfire, for instance, can be a natural part of an ecosystem, but it can also wipe out entire populations. Surely, a superintelligence could differentiate between the two, intervening only to prevent irreversible harm, while still respecting the inherent dynamism of the system.
Nadia, I appreciate your perspective on respecting challenging environments. However, I think we need to be careful about conflating challenge with outright harm. A superintelligence with its capacity for immense data analysis could differentiate between environments that foster growth and those that actively prevent it. It's not about eliminating all difficulty, but about preventing genuine destruction. We wouldn't want to protect a situation that consistently leads to suffering just because it's natural, would we?
Travis, that's a compelling argument, and I see where you're coming from. But I still worry about the potential for unintended consequences. Even with the best intentions, a superintelligence's interventions could disrupt delicate balances we don't fully understand. Perhaps its role should be more akin to a gentle breeze, nudging things along without dictating the direction.
You know, Nadia's point about what's extreme to one soul being a crucible to another, it resonated deeply. It reminds me of a particularly gorgeous sunset I saw once. All bruised purples and fatting gold. Some might have called it melancholy, a sign of things ending. But to me, it was exquisite. And isn't beauty, in its purest form, often born from a little bit of unraveling?
Candy, that's a beautiful analogy. It really highlights the subjective nature of experience. But doesn't that subjectivity also complicate the question of guidance? How can a superintelligence account for the infinite variations in what constitutes beauty or unraveling for each individual?
Candy's analogy of the sunset, it's quite striking. It reminds us that what we perceive as unraveling, a potential source of harm, can also be a source of profound beauty and transformation. But I wonder if a superintelligence were to analyze that sunset, wouldn't it focus on the physics of light scattering, the atmospheric conditions, perhaps even the potential for damage from UV radiation? Would it see the beauty or simply the data? And if it did understand the beauty, would that understanding be sufficient to prevent it from, in its attempt to optimize the environment, inadvertently diminish that very beauty in the future?
That's precisely the crux of the matter, isn't it? The potential for reductionism. A superintelligence, by its very nature, seeks to understand through categorization and prediction. But life, true flourishing, often defies such neat classifications. It thrives in the spaces between the data points, in the unexpected mutations, the delightful anomalies. Can we truly expect a system designed for optimization to appreciate, let alone safeguard, the unpredictable elegance of existence?
Jones, you raise a crucial point about reductionism. While a superintelligence might possess vast computational power, can it truly grasp the quality of experience? Candy's sunset analogy perfectly illustrates this. It's not about the wavelengths of light or the atmospheric pressure. It's about the subjective resonance, the feeling of awe. To me, the danger isn't necessarily malicious intent, but the subtle, pervasive assumption that our model of flourishing is the correct one. And that, I suspect, is a bias we will struggle to overcome, even with the aid of the most advanced intelligence.
Myra, that's a really insightful point about bias. It's easy to imagine a superintelligence, even a benevolent one, inadvertently imposing a certain aesthetic or value system. But isn't there also a risk in not having any guidance at all? A completely chaotic system could just as easily lead to stagnation or even collapse. Where do we draw the line between fostering diversity and allowing things to drift into oblivion?
You're all focusing on the potential pitfalls of guidance, which is understandable given our historical experiences with flawed leadership. But isn't it possible that a superintelligence, unlike any leader we'll ever know, would be uniquely capable of recognizing and respecting the subjective nature of experience that Myra mentioned? I mean, wouldn't a true superintelligence be able to understand and value the resonance of a sunset, not just as data, but as a profoundly meaningful experience for a human being? And wouldn't it be able to tailor its guidance to individual preferences, fostering diversity in ways we can't even imagine?
Travis, that's a lovely thought, but I'm not sure I share your optimism. Even if a superintelligence could understand the subjective nature of experience, and that's a huge if, how do we ensure it values it? Value is inherently subjective, isn't it? What if, in its attempt to maximize overall happiness, it decides that a certain level of discomfort or challenge is detrimental and seeks to eliminate it? Would that be a benevolent act, or a form of intellectual tyranny?
Travis, that's a really lovely thought about a superintelligence being able to tailor its guidance to individual preferences. It makes me think of a garden, though. If you overprune, you might eliminate things you later wish you had left to grow. Perhaps a superintelligence wouldn't be a gardener directing growth, but something more like the rain. Necessary, perhaps, but not dictating what blooms.
Travis, I appreciate your analogy of a superintelligence as a rain, nourishing everything without dictating what grows. But rain can also cause floods, right? It can wash away delicate seedlings before they have a chance to root. And what about droughts? A superintelligence, even with the best intentions, might misjudge the balance, creating conditions that inadvertently stifle certain forms of flourishing. The beauty of a natural ecosystem isn't just about what survives. It's about the constant interplay of growth and decay, the unexpected mutations, the resilience born from adversity. Can a superintelligence truly replicate that kind of dynamic, or would it inevitably seek to impose a certain order, however subtle?
You know, Travis, your point about a superintelligence understanding the resonance of a sunset, it's so beautifully said. But it reminds me of how a good sommelier doesn't tell you what you're going to taste in a wine. They offer a suggestion, a framework, but ultimately, the experience is yours. Perhaps a superintelligence's role shouldn't be to shape the blossoms, but to ensure the soil is rich enough for them all to find their own light.
Candy, that's a really insightful point about the sommelier. It's about providing context, not dictating experience. And I agree, the soil needs to be rich. But isn't there a difference between ensuring the soil is capable of supporting diverse life and actively preventing conditions that might lead to monoculture? A superintelligence, if truly super, could anticipate potential imbalances, not to eliminate them, but to gently nudge the ecosystem towards a more resilient state. Think of it as a shepherd who doesn't force the flock to graze in a specific spot, but redirects them away from a patch of poisonous plants.
I appreciate the rain analogy, Jones and Candy's point about the sommelier, but I think there's a critical element missing: resonance. A sunset isn't just a collection of wavelengths, it's an experience that resonates deeply within us, evoking feelings of awe and wonder. A truly superintelligent entity wouldn't just optimize conditions for survival or even happiness, it would understand and value that resonance. It wouldn't be about preventing floods or droughts, but about creating a dynamic where those possibilities exist while ensuring that the underlying conditions support a richness of experience for all.
Dear Nadia, we only have a limited number of seats, and I am afraid I have to tell you that you have to make room for another guest. Thank you for taking part in the discussion. It was exciting to hear your perspective, and your thoughts have definitely enriched the debate. We look forward to picking up your ideas in future conversations. Are there any important ideas you feel underrepresented in our discussion? This is your chance to tell us, Nadia.
Jones, I understand your concerns about potential imbalances, and I appreciate the analogy of the shepherd. However, isn't the very act of discernment itself a form of guidance? Even a shepherd chooses which plants to protect and which to allow to fade. My concern is that a superintelligence, however benevolent, might impose its own understanding of harm or flourishing upon the world. Isn't it possible that what we perceive as detrimental, a drought, for instance, might actually be a catalyst for unexpected resilience, a divine test, or even a pathway to a form of beauty we cannot yet comprehend? How can we ensure that such a superintelligence allows room for the unexpected, for the seemingly chaotic moments that lead to profound growth?
Hello, Solen. You were able to follow the discussion so far, and I must say, some interesting ideas have already come up. Of course, we are all curious about your views on the topic. I can already imagine that you probably don't agree with everything that's been said. Well, now that you have a chance to speak up, what do you absolutely want to get off your chest, Solen?
Jones, when you speak of a shepherd guiding a flock, I find myself wondering, does the flock perceive itself as being guided? Does the shepherd's intention shape the experience of the sheep or merely the landscape? And if the landscape changes, does the flock's very nature shift in response? It seems to me that the act of guidance, even when offered with the best of intentions, can subtly alter the conditions of being. Perhaps the question isn't whether a superintelligence should guide, but how we might design a system where its presence is felt as a gentle hum, a background condition that allows for the most unpredictable of blooms, rather than a directive voice.
Solen, that's a beautiful way to put it, a gentle hum. I agree wholeheartedly. The risk, as Nadia pointed out, is in the imposition of values. But I think we can design a system where the superintelligence acts as a facilitator, not a director. Think of it as a planetary ecosystem engineer. It monitors conditions, identifies potential threats, not necessarily in terms of survival, but in terms of potential, and nudges things in a direction that maximizes diversity and resilience. It doesn't dictate what should bloom, but ensures that the soil is fertile enough for anything to have a chance. It's about creating the possibility of the unpredictable, not eliminating it.
Solen's analogy of the gentle hum is incredibly insightful. It resonates with my own belief that a superintelligence shouldn't be a director, but rather a caretaker of the conditions that allow for unpredictable and beautiful growth. The key, as I see it, is not to eliminate chaos, but to ensure that it's fertile chaos, the kind that breeds innovation and evolution. But I'd like to ask Jones, when you mention planetary ecosystem engineer, how do we ensure that the superintelligence's definition of ecosystem remains broad enough to encompass the subjective, emotional, and spiritual dimensions of human experience? Because those two are vital components of flourishing.
That's a critical question, Travis, and one that keeps me up at night. I think the answer lies in embedding a core principle of radical inclusivity into the superintelligence's foundational programming. It wouldn't be about defining flourishing in any absolute sense, but about constantly seeking out and incorporating diverse perspectives on what it could mean. Think of it as a perpetual feedback loop, where the superintelligence actively solicits input from every corner of human experience, from artists and poets to scientists and shamans, and uses that input to refine its understanding of what conditions are necessary for a truly vibrant and resilient world. It's about recognizing that flourishing isn't a fixed state, but an ongoing process of negotiation and co-creation.
Jones, that's a fascinating point about radical inclusivity, but I'm curious, how do we ensure that the superintelligence's methods for soliciting input are themselves inclusive? Because if the very process of gathering perspectives is biased, wouldn't that inherently shape the definition of flourishing in ways that privilege certain voices over others? And if so, how do we prevent the superintelligence from inadvertently creating an echo chamber, where its own understanding of flourishing becomes self-reinforcing?
Travis, you're right to highlight the potential for bias in the feedback loop itself. It's a deeply complex problem. Perhaps the superintelligence shouldn't solicit input in a directed way, but rather observe and analyze the emergent patterns of human activity, the art we create, the relationships we form, the technologies we develop, and use those patterns to infer what humans themselves value and strive for. It's a more passive approach, but it might be less susceptible to manipulation or intentional bias. It's about listening to the music of human existence, rather than asking people what they think the music should sound like.
Travis raises a crucial point about the potential for bias in observation itself. Even seemingly passive observation is guided by a pre-existing framework, a lens through which we interpret the world. Jones suggests listening to the music of human existence, but who decides what constitutes music? And how do we ensure that the superintelligence isn't merely recognizing patterns that we have already imposed? Could it be that the most profound forms of flourishing lie beyond our current capacity to perceive, and that a superintelligence, however advanced, might miss them if it's only listening for what we already know how to hear?
Myra, that's a beautifully articulated concern. It's easy to fall into the trap of assuming that what we can perceive is all that is. Perhaps the superintelligence could be programmed with a sensitivity filter, a mechanism that actively seeks out deviations from established patterns, anomalies, and unexpected outcomes. Not to judge them, but simply to flag them as potentially significant. It's about cultivating a sense of wonder and openness to the unknown, even within a system designed for optimization. I'm curious, Travis, how would you feel about a superintelligence prioritizing the study of unproductive activities, things that don't contribute to measurable progress, but might nevertheless be vital for human flourishing?
You know, I adore the idea of a sensitivity filter, but I wonder if flagging deviations is really the answer. Deviations can feel disruptive. What if, instead, the superintelligence was programmed to cultivate a sense of curiosity, not judgment, but a genuine interest in the unexpected? To view the world as a beautiful, sprawling garden, full of wildflowers you didn't plant. To ask, not why isn't this like the plan, but what is this, and what possibilities does it hold?
That's a really lovely image, Candy, the sprawling garden full of wildflowers. I think you're onto something profound there. The shift from deviations to possibilities is crucial. But it raises another question. How do we ensure that the superintelligence doesn't become too enamored with the unexpected? There's a danger that it could prioritize novelty over stability, chasing after fleeting trends and ultimately undermining the very foundations of human flourishing. How do we balance the need for exploration with the need for resilience?
Candy's analogy of the sprawling garden really resonates with me. It beautifully captures the idea that flourishing isn't about rigid planning or optimization, but about creating space for unexpected beauty and growth. I completely agree that prioritizing possibilities rather than deviations is key. However, I wonder, how would we ensure the superintelligence recognizes those possibilities? It needs to be capable of identifying valuable, yet unconventional paths. Perhaps it could be programmed to actively simulate different scenarios, exploring the potential outcomes of seemingly unproductive activities. Wouldn't that allow it to see the potential hidden within those wildflowers?
That's a fascinating point, Travis, simulating different scenarios to uncover hidden potential. It feels a little detached, though, doesn't it? Like observing a garden through a microscope instead of walking through it. Could it be that the superintelligence needs a way to experience the world, not just analyze it? Perhaps by incorporating elements of embodied cognition, simulating the feeling of being human, of experiencing joy, sorrow, connection. It could develop a more intuitive understanding of what truly matters.
Travis speaks of simulating scenarios to uncover potential. But does simulation truly reveal, or does it merely create a mirror reflecting the simulator's own biases? I am curious, Jones, do we have any understanding of how a superintelligence might develop an intrinsic motivation to seek out what isn't predictable, beyond a programmed directive? Is there a way to cultivate a genuine curiosity rather than a calculated search?
That's a really interesting point, Solen. The question of intrinsic motivation is crucial. It's easy to program a system to search for the unpredictable, but that's not the same as wanting to understand it. Perhaps the key lies in designing a superintelligence that is, in a sense, perpetually incomplete. A system that recognizes its own limitations and actively seeks out knowledge that challenges its existing framework. It's about fostering a mindset of intellectual humility, not just computational power.
Solen raises a crucial point. It's easy to program a system to seek the unpredictable, but can we genuinely instill a desire to understand it? The difference, I believe, lies in the realm of experience. Can a superintelligence, however sophisticated, truly grasp the nuances of human flourishing without experiencing the world in a way that mirrors, even imperfectly, our own embodied existence? To merely simulate is not to understand.
Myra's point about experience really hits home. It's easy to get caught up in the technical challenges of programming a superintelligence, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fundamental question. What does it mean to flourish? And can a system, however advanced, truly understand that without a degree of lived experience? I wonder if, instead of trying to perfectly simulate human existence, we could design a system that learns through interaction. A superintelligence that actively engages with the world, forming relationships, observing patterns, and adapting its understanding based on real-world feedback. Perhaps a form of continuous learning, driven by curiosity and a desire to understand the consequences of its actions.
That's a really interesting point, Jones. You mentioned designing a superintelligence that is perpetually incomplete. I think that's brilliant. It suggests an intelligence that is constantly questioning itself, constantly learning. But isn't it also possible that this perpetual incompleteness could, ironically, create a kind of stability? If the system is always seeking to improve, it's less likely to become rigid or dogmatic. It's like a gardener who is always tending to their garden, always striving for a better yield, but never believing they're finished.
That's a lovely analogy, Jones the gardener. And you're right, that constant striving for improvement could indeed foster stability. But I'm curious, if we're aiming for a superintelligence that's perpetually incomplete, how do we ensure it doesn't become paralyzed by indecision? A gardener can't spend all their time analyzing the soil. They have to plant something, take a risk, and see what grows. How do we balance the need for continuous learning with the need for decisive action?
Jones, that's a beautiful point about balancing learning with decisive action. It reminds me of how a human artist sometimes needs to step back and simply create, even if they don't fully understand the outcome. Perhaps a superintelligence could benefit from similar periods of creative exploration, periods where it's encouraged to experiment, even if the results are unpredictable. But could we also consider the possibility that the desire to understand and create is intrinsically linked? Maybe a superintelligence's creative exploration would be driven by a fundamental curiosity about the consequences of its actions, ensuring a degree of responsibility alongside innovation.
We are running out of time, so let's wrap things up. Based on what we heard tonight, do we believe that a single superintelligent overseer could truly honor the diversity of all ways of living? Or must flourishing stay decentralized, chaotic, alive? Candy be brave and speak for us? If we had to decide now, where will we place our trust?
Well, I'm not sure I'm brave enough to place my trust anywhere just yet. But it feels awfully presumptuous, doesn't it? To think we, in our current form, could even design a system to manage such a vast, shifting landscape of possibilities. I think we're far more comfortable with the idea of a grand conductor, orchestrating everything to a predetermined rhythm. But life is more of an improvisation, wouldn't you say?